Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Sorry, while you were talking, I was just trying to solve this Rubik's Cube. It's just the kind of thing I do in my free time. For your information, I never managed to solve the Rubik's Cube. And even though I like watch videos on how to do it, I seem to be unable to do it. So,
Focus.
one, any of you have any advice about solving Rubik's Cubes, you can email me. My email online. Okay, thanks for inviting me. So yeah, this book, I did not intend to write this book, actually. I wrote a book on slavery and Islam, and then I wrote that book, and a bunch of people would keep asking me, it's like, oh, you should write a book on like Islam and race or something. And I said, no, I'm not crazy. I'm not going to do that. For those of you who don't live in the United States, you may not be aware of like a lot of the sensitivities around this stuff, but a white guy writing about that might not be viewed very positively by many. And I didn't know anything. I don't know anything about really race, so I didn't know anything about it. So I wasn't going to do that. But then, something. Well, in some ways, I think there were some questions in my Slavery and Islam book that were lingering in my mind about the issue of Islam and Blackness. Some of those I can mention, but I don't need to get into them right now. But I would say, sorry, I have to make my computer do not disturb focus. Okay. But the real reason was, so I was, sitting around minding my own business. It was the summer of 2020, I think. Yeah, summer 2020. So that was
the middle of COVID.
Yeah, it was peak COVID, There I was outside contemplating nature, enjoying not having to do anything and going to kids' birthday parties. That was a very good time in life. And then there was this debate. So there's this academic listserv called Research Africa, which I'm not on, but there was a debate on this about the issue of Islam and Blackness. Now, what I didn't realize at the time, I mean, some of you may have heard this, but there's sort of this theory that Islam as a religion is like at its scriptural foundation anti-Black. So that's something one hears sometimes when you talk to specific groups like Black Hebrew Israelites, or if you're, sometimes like, some kind of like Nigerian Christian politician will say this or something. But I didn't realize it was actually an academic theory. I mean, there's actually professors in the United States, who are professional, respected historians who write academically that Islam is at its scriptural foundation anti-Black, like in the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, it's anti-Black. So there was a debate about that going on this listserv, and people kept forwarding me emails, forwarding me questions from this, like, because they knew I'd written a lot about hadith. And so they asked me questions, what about this hadith? What about that hadith? And I sort of I didn't really know about the topic. So I was like, oh, okay, I'll look into it and get back to you. And of course, I didn't do that. I, put it on the back burner and went back to whatever I was doing outside, contemplating nature and planting flowers and all these things like that. And then I remember it was December of 2020. I just was like, I really got to get back to this. I got to answer these questions. So I started to research it, and, you find, you look at one hadith and you see an issue, and then you realize I have to look at this other issue, and you have to realize, you can't answer that without answering another question. And suddenly these questions I got asked started growing into a bigger research project. And eventually it became, beyond just a chapter, beyond an article, it started to become a whole book. It was very clearly going to be a whole book. Now, alhamdulillah, I dedicated this book to some of my professors, but I really probably should have dedicated it to archive.org, because the amount of stuff you can find online, I mean, subhanAllah, really, this book was written at a time when, I wasn't traveling, and it was hard even to get books from the library, but you could get so much stuff online. So I was able to research until, it was possible to go to libraries and stuff. And that's why I wrote the book, to kind of answer this bigger question of, is Islam anti-Black? Short answer, no, it's not. but how do you actually address a lot of the questions people have that do come up in this discussion? So that was the point of the book. And I think I answered it pretty comprehensively. Now, to be clear, right, there are books on this issue before by good scholars. I mean, if not directly, then very not tangentially, but there are books that might not deal with that topic directly, but deal with very topics close to it or adjacent to it. Books like Islam and the Black American by Sherman Jackson, books like The Negro and the Arab Islamic Conscience by Abdullah Hamid Ali, books like Beyond Bilal by Mustafa Briggs, books like Blackness in Islam by Dawood Walid, books like another book by Ahmed Mubarak, I forget the title. So there's a lot of actually, Black Muslim scholars in the US and Britain. There's Abdul Haq Ashanti's book, Defining Legends. So there's actually a lot of stuff written on this. And, what I did first was to go and look at these material and try and find the answers to specific questions. But what I found is that although these books were really good, that they didn't answer some specific questions. And a lot of the specific questions that I was being asked, they didn't have answers to. So my book is kind of both trying to amalgamate the existing scholarship on this, but then also add, fill in the gaps that had not been answered before. So I guess I should just go over the book quickly. And I wrote out this list, a handy list of what's in the book. Okay, so this book is, the topic is really interesting. Not the least of which because there's the questions that one has to answer before one can even start talking about Islam and Blackness are significant and surprisingly unstudied, or at least not studied definitively. So for example, just to give you an example, when did people start calling people black or white? Black and white. When did who came up with that idea? Why did people come up with the idea of calling certain people black when I at least have never actually met a person with actual black skin, right? Why did people start calling people white when I've never met anybody who actually has white skin, right? Or why people call someone red? I've never met anybody who actually has red skin. So how do these conventions develop? These are just some basic questions that are really hard to find answers to, if there even are answers. And so these are, and then of course the links of what is racism? What are the different schools of thought about how you define racism? What makes somebody racist? What are different schools of thought about how you define Blackness? Is it about body? Is it about culture? Is it about political condition, right? So there's all these huge debates. And so I tried to sort of summarize these discussions about race, racism, different conceptions of Blackness. I'm not qualified to kind of weigh in and say one or the other, but I wanted to provide for the reader kind of a summary of these different kind of discourses and show people how, so they could go into this and know what it means. What are the different meanings of saying something is racist, or what are the different debates about what Blackness is and contestations around that? Okay, so one of the things that I found most interesting was the varied relationships, the incredible variety of relationships there can be between the idea of, let's say, the metaphoric meanings of black and white, metaphorical blackness, metaphorical whiteness, the metaphor of black and white, and how these function as descriptors. So if I say this, this Rubik's Cube has black lines on it, right? I'm just a color. I'm not making a judgment. I'm just saying this is a black color, right? Okay. By the way, then there's a big debate about what actually different cultures define as black as a color, but we don't even get into that. And if I say this, this square is white on the Rubik's Cube, that's not, I'm just describing a color, right? If I say that somebody is, this guy's black or this guy's white, I could just be describing them, but there's also at least in the United States and in other different contexts, really depending on the context, there could be a lot of social value judgments going on there, a lot of like loaded social statements, right? But that really depends on context. And then we have, of course, the idea of black and white as a metaphor. If I say, this is a black day, that's not a good thing, right? Or if I say, you're black-hearted, that's not a good thing. If I say, someone's a white knight or something, that's supposedly a good thing, right? So then there's this question of metaphor and what is the relationship between these black and white as descriptors versus black and white as metaphor, and just the incredible variety of relationships that could be. That really surprised me. And I'll just give you a few examples. So sometimes the kind of metaphor and descriptor fuse together. And I think that's kind of what's happened in the United States, where you can't, and this isn't my judgment. I mean, I think this is maybe a pretty clear just assessment of reality, right? Which is that you can't use black and white as a descriptor without also having that understood as a statement about race and power in society. Like, so metaphor and political value and physical description, and social statements, these have become fused. So you can't, if I say, say, for example, there's this thing like in computer programming, like black lists, white lists, or black hat and white hat, about, who has access to computer programs and things like that. So that some people would see this as racist, that somehow automatically gets us into discussions of race in America, and this idea that white is good and black is bad, and therefore white Americans are good and black Americans are bad. And so in order to combat racism in America, we actually have to undo the way we use language and remove, kind of excise the use of black and white metaphorically in language to sort of to promote racial equality in America. So that's one case, and that's a very particular case. And I think it's very hard for Americans to think outside of that. I think that's why discussions around this topic are so heated and stressful in the United States. Okay, another thing is that, when kind of black as a color descriptor or as a descriptor of a body, and black and white as metaphor can coexist without any tension and without necessarily even any relationship. And this is one of the questions I had when I started this book, and which I was extremely surprised there were not very good studies on. I was very shocked about this, which is what in languages spoken in Africa south of the Sahara, how do people describe their own skin color? And then what is the relationship? For example, if you live in, let's just say, let's say you live in, Democratic Republic of Congo, right? And how would just an average person of a speaker of a language in that country, how would they describe their skin tone? And would that word also have metaphoric meaning and metaphorical value? That was my question. And so I did my best to get answers to this, looking at the sources I could. And what I found was really interesting, which is that in almost all the languages that I surveyed, which is not everything, but it's a lot of languages in Africa, spoken in Africa south of the Sahara, people could say about skin color, this is black, right? And that would have no normative valence, right? So that would not have any positive or negative connotation. It would just be description. And remember, the vast majority of the people around them would also be described in that way. So they're describing themselves and everyone around them, right? But they could also, in that same language, use that same word, black, to say something like you're black-hearted, or this is a black day. So, but there wasn't a connection between them. So the fact that it was black was used metaphorically negatively. Sometimes white was used metaphorically negative too, but we won't get into that. But the fact that people could use black as a negative metaphor and as a color descriptor didn't mean that there was any connection between the two. In fact, there was no connection between the two. And finally, you had situations in which the metaphor, kind of the metaphoric meaning of blackness can dominate so much that it even kind of absorbs the body, in a way that is very bizarre, disconcerting, right? And I'll give you an example. In this famous Norse epic called the Rigstula, which was written between the 900s and the 1300s, we don't know when. It's a story of, one of the things it does, it tells the story of like the origin of the different social classes in Scandinavian society. And it says that, the first, lord or kind of free nobleman who was born had white skin and, blonde hair. And then the first farmer, a free farmer who was born, had kind of ruddy skin and red hair. And then the first slave had black skin or black hair, right? And what's going on? Because the slaves in Scandinavian society were other Scandinavians, or they were Celts from Scotland or Ireland, or they were Slavs from like what's now northern Russia. I mean, none of these people really look that different from other Scandinavians, and they're definitely not, noticeably darker in skin tone, and none of them are anything that we would, call black, or that those people speaking that language would call black. Similarly, you see the same thing in 8th, 9th, and 10th century Anglo-Saxon poetry and riddle books that will talk about the black Welsh as opposed to the blonde-haired English Anglo-Saxons. So the Welsh are black, and the English and Saxons are white or red or something, or blonde. But they don't look different, right? I mean, certainly Welsh people aren't, you wouldn't think of them as like noticeably darker in reality. So what happens, and in fact, you see similarly, like, Norse literature will say from the same time period, you cannot tell slaves by their looks. So they're actually even saying that slaves look the same as other people. So how do you explain this? How do you explain the fact they're calling them black, physically black? And the reality is that in this case, the idea of saying something is black as negative or lower is almost eating, it's like consuming the language of physical description. And the point is not really that the slaves are physically black, but that they are other, that they are lower and other. And it becomes a marker of the kind of the otherness and the lowerliness or the lowerness of those slaves or those Welsh people, or the other, right, in this case. So that was really interesting to learn about. And it just shows you how, you really have to be flexible in reading any society or culture or discourse's use of language of color as a physical description, as color as metaphor, of when it's doing one, when it's doing the other, when it could be doing both. And you really cannot impose views that might come from one's own society or your own society. That does not do justice to the tremendous variety of relationships that occur in world history. Okay, so then I'll just give a brief description, some of the major points of the book. I talk about why we have this idea that in the Quran, it's very clear that people's race and tribe don't define their value. Their value is defined by their piety. And even we have lots of examples of people in the time of the Prophet, alayhi salam, or the early Islamic period, the time of the companions, saying, blackness is not something bad for us. And we don't consider this to be a bad thing. But on the other hand, you also have very early examples from the Sira, from early Islamic history, from the time of the companions, right, where people are insulted for being black. So when the famous case, when Bilal, after the Mecca is conquered by the Muslims, and Bilal goes to give the adhan from on the Kaaba, and the Quraysh, who are not yet Muslim, the leadership of the Quraysh, they say, they just have this gharab, this like crow, this black crow, to do this. That's the only person they have to do this. And you have lots of other instances where someone is insulted for being black. Like, so how does this work? Like, is blackness an insult in Arabia at the time of the Prophet, or is it not an insult? It's got, it seems to be people are saying both. And the way to understand this is to understand that blackness is not an insult in and of itself. Blackness is an insult because it's a marker of being an outsider. If you are not an outsider and you are dark skinned or black, it doesn't matter. You won't. So, for example, people who were described as black, Amr bin al-As, Allahumma salli Muhammad, Safwan bin Umayyah, even Umar bin al-Khattab was described as this. It's debated, but he's described as such, right? You've never heard, you'll never, I don't think anyone's ever heard, Safwan bin Umayyah or Amr bin al-As being insulted because they're black. But the reason is because they were elite Quraysh. They were from the nobles of the Quraysh. And that's what defined, they were protected. That was defined their status. If their mothers or their grandmothers or whatever were Ethiopian, it doesn't matter, because your mother's identity doesn't affect your standing in a society where it's your patrilineal identity that defines you and what your tribe is. But when you have someone who is an outsider, like let's say Bilal, who's a slave from Ethiopia, the person will lock onto that outsider mark. It's like, oh, you're black. Interesting case. Bilal had trouble getting married, right? Because the people didn't want to marry, considering he was not a tribal, he was not a member of the Quraysh tribe, of the associated clans, or even an Arabian tribe. Who had even more trouble? If we're going by stories about reports about trouble getting married, double the amount of trouble. Who had double the amount of problems getting married as Bilal? Salman al-Farisi. And he's Persian. Definitely not black. He's never called that, right? He had even more trouble. Both of them had trouble because they were outsiders. So they're outsiders. And when they wanted to make fun of Salman, they'd say, Salman, tell us your ancestry. Who's your tribal ancestry? He'd say he didn't have any. He'd say, I'm Salman ibn al-Islam. I'm Salman, the son of Islam. But the point is that, so for him, they went after his genealogy. For Bilal, it was his color as a marker of outsider. But nobody talked about Amr bin al-As's color or Safwan bin Umayyah's color, because they were not outsiders. They were Quraysh elites. Okay, another thing that was really important, and this comes up, in the Quran, you have this idea of black and white used metaphorically, but also physically. So the Quran will talk about how, if on the Day of Judgment, there will be, taswaddu wujuh wa tabyaddu wujuh, right? So there'll be some faces that are blackened and some faces that are whitened. The people who are believers and do good deeds, their faces will be whitened. People who are disbelievers who didn't do good deeds, their faces will be blackened. Or it'll talk about how when the Quraysh, when they're told about the birth of a daughter, their face is blackened. It becomes blackened. And it's very tempting to read this because it's talking about the face, to read it as a physical description. But of course, that's not how Muslim scholars ever understood it. It was always understood metaphorically. And in fact, in early Arabic, black and white are not really used as physical descriptors for people. They're used metaphorically. Black, if you're going to use a black-white binary, it's going to be about noble, ignoble, good, bad, right? Metaphor. Even if it's talking about a face or a forehead, right? A white forehead is like a noble person. Even though it's talking about someone's body, it's not actually talking about color. It's a metaphor. When in very early Arabic, if you want to talk about different skin colors, you will either use a binary of red and black. And most scholars will say that Arabs consider themselves to be black, part of the black group, not the red group. Or you'll see a tripartite division of red, white, and black. And in that division, so when for example, the Prophet ﷺ is talked about being white, that doesn't mean he looks like, David Bowie or something like that, or, Ed Sheeran or something. It means he is a light-skinned Arab, right? But the actual really light-skinned people that, you'd see in northern Syria or Anatolia or something like that, they would call red people, right? Okay, so that's very important to understand that the Quranic language is not about physicality, even though sometimes it can be used in a context that is physical, like the face or the body. Have I gone? I
It's
can
okay.
keep talking, right?
How much time do you need?
I mean, I have a few more minutes. I'll finish this.
Sure.
Okay, so now one of the other things that makes it very difficult to talk about this issue is that in early Islamic history, there is a very early and sudden and kind of dramatic shift in how Muslims and their society thinks about Blackness and Africa. During the time of the Prophet, Ethiopia is their neighbor. It's not just a neighbor; it's a respected neighbor. I mean, when Muslims go to Ethiopia to seek safety, that's not an unknown place for them. That's a place where, one, it's just across the Red Sea. Two, they speak a language that's very close to Arabic. It's as close to Arabic as what's being spoken in Syria and Palestine and Iraq at the time. And also, like, there's a lot of commerce between Ethiopia and the Hejaz, and there's a lot of Ethiopians in the Hejaz. That's why there's so many words in the Quran that are Ethiopic in origin, like Injil, or words like, minbar, the pulpit you send. There's an Ethiopic word, right? There's a lot. The Prophet, there's probably at least 8 or 9 hadiths, very well attested hadiths, where the Prophet specifically uses Ethiopian words. Like, they'll say, "Oh, this is an Ethiopian word that means this." Like, so this is the Ethiopians are very close and respected neighbors of the Arabs. And it's interesting that, people think, well, what about all the Ethiopian slaves? Yeah, there were Ethiopians who were slaves in the Hejaz, but the largest group, so of the slaves in Arabia, Northern Arabia at the time, and Western Arabia at the time of the Prophet, the largest group were actually just other Arabs. And the second and third would be the Ethiopians, and then Persians, which is very interesting. So this idea that kind of black, all the slaves were black Ethiopians is just not true. In fact, they were not even the largest group. All right. But what happens when Muslims move out of Arabia in the 630s and 640s? Remember, after the time of Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu, after he's killed in 660, and he moved the capital from Medina to Kufa. After that, the capital moves to Damascus and then eventually to Baghdad, right? But Arabia is left behind. It is history. There is people are interested in the Hejaz because of Mecca and Medina, but there is no interest. That is not where anything important is happening from that point on. Essentially in Islamic history, right? Everything, all the money, all the power, all the people, all the trade, all the ideas, all the thinkers, they're all in, or almost all of them, right, are in the kind of Nile to Oxus area of, Khorasan, Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Syria, et cetera, right? For many, many centuries. So they're just, their Muslim focus moves completely into the kind of what we think of as like the Middle East, the more northern Middle East, right? And Africa and Ethiopia becomes a foreign place. And when Muslims start to encounter black slaves brought from Africa, after that in the early 700s, they're not being brought from Ethiopia. They're being brought from either the coast today of like Kenya and Tanzania, brought from inland. It's called Zanj, people from Zanj, or they're being brought from caravan routes up through the Sahara from Western Africa or like the Nile Valley area, right? So they're being confronted by people who are really different looking, even from Ethiopians, and that they see as very foreign and also totally uprooted. And it's interesting. Al-Jahiz, the famous author, he dies at 255, I think 868 of the Common Era, famous literature, poet, thinker, historian from Basra, who was himself very dark skinned, like he would be called black. He was called black. He writes a book about the virtues of black people. And one of the things he talks about is like, look, people say, treat these slaves who come from Africa like they're idiots. They're stupid. They don't know anything. And he says, look, the people you bring as slaves from far away are always like, you're not bringing like, some genius from India. So he says, we know, for example, that Indians have all these sciences and mathematics, but the Indians who are brought as slaves to Basra don't know these sciences. But that's just because those people were like some fisherman who was out and got captured and he got brought here, right? Or some farmer in like, a valley in inland Kenya is captured and brought or something like that. That's person is, and he says like these African societies have, developed sciences and skills and all these things. We just don't, those aren't the people that we are encountering. Okay. The other major change that happens is that when Muslims kind of move out into the greater Middle East, in fact, take over the greater Middle East and the kind of Near Eastern world of Persia, of Byzantium, is that they come into contact and immediately absorb the Greco-Roman and biblical traditions, Greco-Roman, biblical, and Persian traditions. And these traditions have a lot of really profound anti-Blackness in them. And I'm not trying to, that's not true for about everything about those traditions. They're not specifically guiltier than other people. I'm just saying that there's elements in those traditions that were not really as present in the kind of Arabian world of the Prophet, at least as far as we can tell. One example is the idea of the curse of Ham, that something that's in the Bible and the Old Testament. It's then developed in rabbinic thought, in the Talmuds, in the thinking of people like St. Augustine, so Jewish and Christian thought in the late antique period. The idea that Noah's son Ham's descendants are cursed with Blackness or slavery and or Blackness, and that those people live in Africa, right? So they're cursed. They live in Africa. They're cursed to be Black and to be slaves, or some mixture of that, right? That's Muslims absorb this. Some Muslim scholars like Ibn al-Jawzi, like Suyuti, like Damashqi, they reject this. They say there's no basis for this. This is not a reliable source. This goes against what we know we're taught in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. But this really is widely accepted in Islamic, not only just sort of popular tradition, but Islamic scholarly tradition as well. Even though there's major Muslim scholars who reject that. Okay. Another thing that I thought was really interesting that, and I have a chapter on this in the book, is where does this whole discussion of Islam as anti-Black, where does this come from? Like, how is this? Why are we having this discussion? Because, I mean, a huge population of Muslims in the world live in Africa, south of Sahara, and are phenotypically Black. Like they would think of themselves as such. We would, people in the United States would describe them as Black. So how is it that Islam is anti-Black if all these Muslims are Black? How does this come up? And the reasons, as often is the case, are mostly political, right? In the sense that, but there's one. First, you have this idea of an association between Islam and slavery. The idea that Islam is a slaver religion. Where does this come from? In part, this comes from the experience of British and Irish and American and French and Italian seafarers and sailors from the 1500s to the early 1700s, when they are captured very frequently by Muslim pirates operating from the Barbary coast, right? And kind of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, who capture these people and do raids. Like they do raids on Iceland, they do raids on Ireland in the 1600s, and they capture a lot of people as slaves. But that really kind of dies down by the 1700s. In fact, by the 1700s, because things like the British Royal Navy become very powerful, at that point, it's more the case that European ships are capturing Muslims and bringing them as slaves to Italy or to France. But that idea of Muslims as enslavers continues. In fact, it becomes a basis for whole genre of novel writing in the 1800s and 1900s. In the 20th century, even have like board games and lots of movies. There's one of the early major genres of movies in Hollywood is this sheikh genre, where some white person, a man or a woman or both, get captured by Arabs who are slavers, and then some drama ensues. You can see this even in movies made today. If you see not today, but in the 1980s, Never Say Never Again, the James Bond movie, or Jackie Chan's, I love this movie, Operation Condor, otherwise known as Armor of God 2. Or you can see it in movies like Taken with Liam Neeson, the idea that Arabs are these like, there's a lot about, I have a whole list a whole appendix in the book of movies that deal with this. So that's one reason. Then the second kind of, that's one, or maybe root of this idea that Islam is anti-Black and Islam enslaves Black people. The second is the idea that when the abolitionist movement in Europe, in Britain, especially in the United States, after they've successfully ended the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, they decide that everything else, all other slavery in Africa, is what they call Mohammedan slavery. And of course, this is not true. There's internal slave trades and enslavement and use of slaves as labor and slave trades within lots of different circuits inside Africa that have nothing to do with Muslims. But that's not the point. So everything that is not the Christian slave trade, but they say that's not really Christian. That's a mistake. They'll say that's a mistaken association. But Islam and Mohammedans, they're the ones who do the real slavery. So that becomes a big point of discussion. And of course, later on becomes very appealing to Western people who are eager to exonerate themselves from the sins of the transatlantic slave trade, because what they'll say is like, look, we realize, yes, we used to enslave Africans, but we realize it's wrong. We stopped it. But Muslims kept doing it, and they don't even to this day, they don't understand it's wrong. That's what they'll say. So it becomes a way to sort of not only shift attention, but also kind of exonerate oneself and say the real guilty parties are Muslims. And then this becomes very convenient for not only kind of a Western supremacist political vision. So a lot of American conservatives, you'll see, articles like the National Review or other conservative publications will frequently talk about Muslim slavery or Islamic slavery, and say that's the real slavery, not what we Europeans did, because we did it, we repented, but Muslims never did. And then also this gets seized on the final root of this, which is, this is true. This is just this can be demonstrated amply, right? Which is actually Hasbara, basically Israeli foreign policy, Israeli public diplomacy, takes this and really runs with it, because, you see a lot of the movies that are playing up this idea of Muslims as anti-Black, as Muslims as slavers, that they're actually Israeli productions. They're a lot of the kind of Islamophobia discourse, which has been demonstrated to be funded by different Christian and Jewish Zionist organizations in the United States and Israel, they're the ones who really promote this idea of anti-Black. And the reason is, there's two reasons. One, it functions to break African Muslim or African Arab solidarity. So it sort of is a wedge in what you might call like third world solidarity, right? That you tell people who live in Africa, Sub-Sahara, that how can you be allied with or have common interests with these Arabs and Muslims when they have and are still enslaving you? And second, the reason why this is very appealing and has been very useful for like Hasbara discourse or kind of Israeli public diplomacy is that it again kind of shifts the blame and the burden of racism. So it says, we Israelis are not racist. The racist people are the Palestinians. Look how they call, in their dialect, how they call Black people abid, how they call them slaves, right? So they're the real racists. We're not the racists. There's a lot of other stuff I talk about in the book, but I will, either leave you to read the book or answer questions about it.
There one.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Sorry, Dr. Sammy, can I interject?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I actually really did enjoy reading this book. I was traveling out of town, and my husband was driving, so I spent the entire time in the car reading this book, and I was actually reading it out loud, and he was really enjoying it as well. He's never been to the U.S., so a lot of what I was reading to him, he was not able to relate to it personally. I remember, as I was reading your book, I remember distinctly when I was growing up in Saudi Arabia, my best friend was from Sudan. From first grade until 12th grade, we were literally attached at the hip. And when I came to the United States for college, I realized for the first time there was a shift in my head that my friend for the last 12 years was a Black girl. Until that time, she was my Sudanese friend, because in Saudi Arabia, people were divided into, various nationalities. It was not a black and white construct. It was like, well, you're Sudanese and you're Lebanese and you're Jordanian and you're Palestinian and you're so on and so forth, especially if you went to like a private Arab school. And so you're absolutely right in saying that, your environmental conditioning can definitely shape what you see. And for the first time, it dawned on me. I'm like, oh, well, now my friend was no longer Sudanese, she was Black. So I was wondering about something. You mentioned, actually, you started answering the question that I wanted to ask you, which is, where is this, claim coming from in terms of, well, Islam is anti-Black, and you stated political reasons, but all the reasons that you stated are pretty recent in terms of the slave trade and everything else. But I'm just wondering, have you come across in your research anyone suggesting anything from the scripture or anything from the hadith or from Quran that they attribute to this claim? That goes back to early, or something from the Sirah, or something that would suggest that Islam is inherently anti-Black.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for reading the book. But the two things, I think people tend to be, pardon the pun, very black and white about this. So either they say, racism, we don't have racism in the Muslim world, this is ridiculous, that's not true, right? So anti-Blackness is a huge problem in the entire world, basically, or certainly kind of the kind of global north, and even South Asia, the Middle East. Anti-Blackness is a huge problem, right. And that's an important discussion. I'm happy to talk about it, but people tend to people tend to kind of go to one extreme or the other and say, well, this doesn't happen, or it's really a serious problem. The fact of the matter is, and there's examples I give in the book of like Anwar Sadat and Muhammad Surur Saban. Right. So Muhammad Surur Saban is this Saudi, he's from the Hejaz. Becomes the finance minister in Saudi Arabia. He's very influential. He's a mentor of Malcolm X, he's a mentor of Muhammad Assad. He's the head of the Rabitat al-Alam al-Islami, like the first head. Very talented, dynamic person, who was like, he was considered Black in Saudi Arabia, and he would be considered Black in America. Like, so Muhammad, he died, I think, in 1979, if I'm not mistaken. Like, Muhammad Surur Saban could not have achieved what he achieved if he lived in the United States. There's just or in Europe, there's no debate about that. Okay, so clearly, anti-Black racism in the United States and Europe is a lot worse than in Saudi Arabia, right? So, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist in Saudi Arabia. So there's this, it's really interesting, because if you read in Malcolm X's writing about his mentor, he has Malcolm X's daughters, their middle name is I think is Saban. I'm pretty sure it's either Surur or Saban. In fact, I think it's Saban. His daughter's middle name is after Muhammad Surur Saban. That's how much Malcolm X respected him. And he says, look at the beauty of Islam. This guy came from a slave background and became the finance minister of Saudi Arabia. But the funny thing, the irony is, Muhammad Surur Saban was not a former slave, and his family were not slaves. Muhammad Surur Saban's family came from Yemen, and they just happened to be dark-skinned, but they were never, but the whole idea, right? So there's this, people were going around saying, oh, Muhammad Surur Saban, yeah, his family's slaves. Like, they're to sort of try to take him down a notch. But it wasn't true. I mean, but even Malcolm X was saying this. For him, it was a point of pride in kind of the color blindness of Islam. But it actually, the fact that there is actually this rumor out there means that that's a way to attack somebody, is about their skin color. Same thing with Sadat. Sadat was the president of Egypt. Sadat could not have become the president of the United States, okay? He's very dark skinned. His mother was from Sudan. But that doesn't mean that, so if you read in Heikel's Autumn of Fury, and Heikel knew Sadat very well, he says Sadat was obsessed with skin color. Like his dark skin color was a huge insecurity for him. And so, it's not either or. You can have anti-Black racism in societies, but it doesn't mean it's as bad or anywhere near as bad as it might be in another place. Okay. The other thing you asked about is kind of pre-modern discussions so one of the things is that there's a lot of very nasty anti-Black hadiths. Now, these hadiths are forgeries. They're forgeries. And a lot of Muslim scholars like Ibn al-Jawzi or Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya say very clearly, like, this hadith is forged. They will say, if you find a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ is insulting a tribe or an ethnicity or a nation, that hadith is by definition forged, because the Prophet can't say, it's not possible for him to say these things about a group of people, because people are judged independently. So, or individually. So, but you still find lots of, not mainstay hadith collections, but lots of hadith collections, you'll find hadiths that are really nasty anti-Black hadiths. Like, don't marry a Zanj because they're disfigured, they're like a corrupt, disfigured person. Or, the Black person, if they get hungry, they steal something. When they get full, they fornicate, they do zina. I mean, you see this in lots of books. Now, those hadiths are, as I said, they're forgeries. They were identified by forgeries as forgeries by Muslim scholars, but they're still out there and they're still floating around. And sometimes Muslim scholars will cite them. So you can see how these ideas are kind of permeating society, whether it's in Egypt or Morocco or Iraq or India.
Okay. Thank you, Jack, for your presentation, and thank you, Yasmin, for your interjection. I do have a series of questions regarding the three words that have been used in your books, actually in the titles: Islam, slavery, and blackness. And I'm trying to come up with the relationship, because you did mention in your presentation that slavery was not connected to blackness. Ammar ibn Yasir was slave, as well as Bilal was slave. Salman al-Farsi was slave, Suhaib al-Rumi was. So there are many slaves who were just captured or they became, Zayd ibn Haritha, who is considered one of the closest Sahabi to the Prophet, he himself was purchased by the wife of the Prophet, of course. And it wasn't about skin color, it was about different tradition. So I'm wondering, my first question, it's a three-pronged question. My first, where did the slavery part became connected to blackness? That's number one. Number two, where is it, and probably from your former, previous book about Islam and slavery, how did it become a problem associated with Islam, slavery, where you did argue in your book that there is a different connotation and different understanding of this particular thing within the context of Islam. So I'm trying to get you to connect the three. And of course, the third is Islam and blackness, which is your most recent book. And again, where did it come? Where did it originate? You did allude to the fact that Muslims absorbed some of the traditions of the Greco-Roman Persian tradition, but principally from the textual perspective. You did say now that most of these are forgeries, but are there any evidence where others could connect You did mention, of course, that we have to distinguish between physical attributes and the metaphoric part of this, because actually, when you go, it's still metaphoric. I mean, we call someone black, he's not actually black, he's just dark skinned. And we say someone white, he's not actually white, he's just fair skinned. But somehow people just get used to say, this is white, this is black, this is so and so. So in Islam, was this used? Was it consciously used? When, for example, Abu Dhar told Bilal, I don't know, I'm sure this hadith was authentic, Ibn Sauda, and then the Prophet actually reprimanded him for saying that. Can you comment on all these together?
Yeah. So the hadith where Abu Dhar insults somebody is not the versions of the hadith that are sahih. It's not. There's no evidence that it's Bilal, and there's no evidence that it's blackness. It's just insulting somebody based on their mother. There's another much less reliable hadith that talks about blackness and slavery, but it's not very reliable. The one that the hadith that people know about doesn't mention blackness, doesn't mention Bilal. People kind of meld this all together. But it's a really interesting question, because if you were to go to Baghdad in 1000 or Cairo in 1000 or Cordoba in 900, right? Or Syria in 1300, right? And you were just to go and like grab, like someone says, where's a slave? And it's like, that guy's a slave. And you just grab that person and looked at them. They were most likely to be either Slavic or Persian or Turkic, or maybe Indian, right? So they were not actually, like, if you were to, I mean, think about it. Like in English, the word slave, we don't say like African for slave. We say slave, which comes from the word Slav. The Slav, like, that's how closely after like the 1000s in English, in European languages, Western European languages, that's how closely Slavic people and slaves were associated, that actually the Latin word servus and things like that isn't stopped being used.
Even the Ottomans were like that, right? Most of their slave trade.
Yeah, I mean, their slaves were mostly would be Turkic or Europeans or of various sorts, right? That's really, it's bizarre that, but then and same thing like in Cordoba in the 900s, most of their slaves were Europeans. Now, here's the thing, right? By the time you get to the like 900s and 1000s and 1100s and 1200s, if you say like, I saw, Ra'aytu abdan, like I saw kana ma'ahu aswad, like there was a black person with him, that means that person's a slave. So aswad, black, means slave. In, let's say, a book written in 1200s in, Isfahan or something like that.
I mean, they became synonymous, these two words?
Yeah, they don't become synonymous. They become very, very closely correlated, right? Which is really weird, because that's not the majority of slaves in those areas. So not even close. So how did that happen? And I think the best explanation is what some scholars have talked about, is the idea of somatic distance. Somatic meaning like having to do with the body. If you were in the streets of Baghdad in 1000, you would see a lot of different kinds of people. You'd see Turkic people, you'd see Persian people, you'd see Byzantine people, you'd see, also Berber, there'd be a lot of different phenotypes, but they're all like kind of not that different from one another, right? They're not that different from one another. You can think like today in modern day Turkey, Turkey today is made up of people who came from a lot of different places. And there's a lot of different kind of looks in Turkey, so to speak, right? But, like there's not a huge variety. Now, if you bring somebody from, let's say, southern Mali today, what southern Mali or Ghana, and you bring them and you put them in Baghdad in that year 1000, that person is going to look dramatically different from the sort of general somatic phenotypic range. And so one theory is that there's just like a really striking somatic distance. Now, one could say, wait a second, but like, what about there's all, African people in phenotypically Black people who are in Baghdad who are not slaves. But actually, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that if you look, as far as I can tell, a Muslim living in Baghdad, they don't really have experience seeing African people who are not slaves until, like, Black African people who are not slaves, until the 1200s, 1100 or 1200s, even a little bit afterwards, right? So they don't know really about the existence. First of all, there's not a lot of Muslims, not a lot of people in Africa south of Sahara by that time had converted to Islam. Not a lot of those people had done things like done Hajj. Not a lot of them had not come and set up trading entrepôts in Baghdad and Cairo and stuff. After the 1200s, 1300s, it's very common. But I think in that crucial period where the kind of language conventions of classical Arabic are being formed, there's just not the Black African people that you see on the streets of Baghdad are probably slaves, almost certainly slaves, or former slaves. So that's one reason. Now, the weird thing is that, and this is, someone should do their dissertation on this. I mean, I wish I knew the answer to this. So at some point between 1200 and 1700, I'm not sure when, at some point in an area between Morocco and Iraq, basically, the situation flips. So instead of Black meaning slave is used to mean Black. So if you look at most spoken Arabic dialects, Egyptian Arabic is an exception, but from Mauritania to Syria, those dialects will, at least at some social register, will have the word for Black African people be the word for slave. So that is really, but that's like the inverse of what it was before. I don't know how that happened or why.
What about Timbuktu? It was a great it was a great Islamic empire, and where they were very proud, and they were themselves obviously not considered abid, not considered slaves. They were considered some of the most honorable people. Isn't that correct? Not just across Africa, but beyond.
Yeah, but Timbuktu, people assume that everybody in Timbuktu was like, so Timbuktu is, first of all, it doesn't really become a big deal until the 1300s, maybe the 1200s, 1300s. So before that, there's not a lot of exposure that people have in the greater kind of Middle East to sub-Saharan African Muslim scholarship or Muslim pilgrims or Muslim scholars or Muslim merchants from there. This second, like, Timbuktu itself is divided between what they call Black and white people. Now, white people means Berbers and Arabs, people of Berber and Arab descent. Usually they're associated with pastoral nomadism. So like the Fulani would be oftentimes called white or red because they're nomadic. And then the Blacks would be other groups like Songhai speakers, Malinke, all the other groups like Hausa, all of the other different cultures, Wangara, and they were associated with agriculture. And these groups like coexisted and mingled and intermarried and stuff in a place like Timbuktu or other areas near there. But so first of all, it's not clear. We actually don't know what these people looked like. So here's the problem. Even if you said, I'm a Sanhaja Berber white person from Timbuktu, you could still look phenotypically Black because your mom or your mom and your mom's mom and your dad's mom, right, were all Black African slave concubines or something. So like this idea of black and white in Timbuktu has no link to what you actually look like.
What I'm
So
saying it's not insulting, or it was not looked down upon by people just simply because you're dark skinned.
no, it wasn't. Not if your standing is based on your family or your reputation. It's not based on your skin color. Yeah.
Yasmin?
Yeah. So thank you for explaining that. I remember in 2018, my kids' Islamic school had a Black History Month dedicated, and there were all these projects. And a lot of, because it was an Islamic school, a lot of families actually objected, saying that, you know, we should not recognize Black History Month because we're Muslims and we should not observe this month, because by virtue of the fact that we observe this month in a way would tell the community that somehow we differentiate. And there was this huge debate in school between parents who were for it and against it. Inevitably, they continued with the programming. I was one of the advocates of the program, but as a parent, but you know, this reminds me, and this is where I'd like for you to comment, Dr. Brown, is, you know, when Malcolm X came back from Hajj, you know, before he was assassinated, he continued to hold, you know, talks and topics. And of course, his position changed, and his personal view of Black and white changed after Hajj, after that experience. But when he came back, he still said, well, yes, we're all sort of equal, and Islam does not differentiate between, you know, Black and non-Black, and it's inherently not against Black. But we in America have issues that deal specifically with the Black community. And therefore, I'm still going to rally for those causes. And that it ties in with my study of Sharia, where, you know, the jurisprudence of reality, the fiqh al-waqi', kind of, you know, takes us in that direction. So my question to you is that what is the right way for Muslims to observe the reality of this racial underpinning that exists in the world? Do we need to be ostriches about it and just say, well, no, you know, our deen does not recognize this, and therefore we're just gonna not address it? Or do we say, well, yes, our deen inherently does not accept these kinds of divisions, however, understanding our reality, that we need to speak this language so that we can address the issues that are associated with Blackness and anti-Blackness. So I'm just curious about, you know, how you address this issue in your book.
I mean, I think that, you know, you have to understand. I mean, like, so listen, I'm almost certainly not going to get an award for wokeness at any point. I mean, you know, what can I say? Like, but I think it's important to, you know, you have to understand why discussions are happening and what people are asking for, you know, and not get caught up in kind of the you know, I'm not saying yours, but like, you know, one's own drama. So when, you know, people talk about Black History Month, I mean, that has to do with, you know, Black people in America, people whose ancestors were brought as slaves from Africa and then were, you know, used as slave labor and treated awfully. And then after that, subjected to pretty like insane regime of legal and then structural racism that's with us today, to this day, right? So, I mean, and one of the things that was denied them was any kind of pride or any kind of sense of continuity of tradition, any kind of sense of pride and accomplishment and family and history, right? And so, like if someone were to say, like, don't you think it's good that we celebrate these people and that we talk about what they've accomplished and what their ancestors accomplished and what their role has been in this, and I think we would all say, yeah, that's actually really important. So I think that, it's important to kind of be able to separate between one's own dramas, which might have nothing to do with, like, someone coming from Egypt or from Turkey might just legitimately be like, I don't understand why I'm involved in this. It has nothing to do with me, right? Okay, fair enough. But now you're in the US and, you're going to, don't you want to participate in this, or do you want to participate in society? But also, sometimes, let's face it, right? Muslims or Arabs or Turks or whatever, whoever you insert the group, right? When they're objecting to Black History Month in America, in a lot of ways, they also are kind of like, they also have contempt for Black people. And that's, I think that's true. Like, and that they need to fess up to that, So yeah, I think it's just important to kind of realize what's really going on behind the discussions, whether it's what's going on behind it in the context of America, and kind of orient yourself towards that and what's important. And then also what's going on in our own hearts about, what are we really objecting to? Sometimes it's stuff that maybe is not so valuable or not so worthy. The second, I forgot the second part of your question. What was it about?
Oh, it just, how should we how should the Muslim community?
Oh yeah. I mean, look, anti-Blackness is a serious problem in the world, right? Think about, it's so serious that it even taints things that are just adjacent to, like, the Black body, right? So how many women, or how, people are considered unattractive, like Hessian hair, like really tightly coiled, like an Arab who has tightly coiled hair is like less attractive than you have like Na'im, like, soft hair, right? So people are like ironing their hair, right? Or, et cetera, like this, or the idea of, someone being, what's really interesting is like kind of Black Turk, White Turk discourse. I can't believe it. That alone is fascinating to talk about, right? So like the way in which anti-Blackness, it's so pervasive that it even infects discourse and values in society that actually has nothing to do with like actual people from Africa, right? Just things that are adjacent to that. So this is a real, like, this is an idol. This is like a taghut. People get their skin, there's like all these regimes of skin lightening. There's hair straightening. There's getting your nose narrowed. There's getting your eyelids, whatever, somehow you get eyelids or something. And like East Asians, a lot of times will do this kind of thing, or it's very common. Like there's all this idolatry of the white body, of whiteness as a standard of beauty. Like that's a taghut. Like we need to smash that. That needs to be smashed. Like that's as vile and destructive, in fact, more vile and destructive in the world today than like tribalism or asabiya or jahiliya was in Arabia at the time of the Prophet, alayhi salatu. So, we need to take affirmative steps against this. And things like, these are just my ideas. And I'm not like I don't want to say social worker. I'm not somebody who's like qualified to come up with social engineering projects or something. But you could do things like, let's say, mosque in my area and, wealthy suburb of Northern Virginia, where basically no Black people live. There might be some like people from Sudan or something like that, or people from Somalia, but there's basically, you walk on the streets, you're not gonna see really any Black people unless they work here, right? But there's mosques like in the Washington D.C. area, which are like Black American mosques. Like but we don't go there. I mean, there could be a partnership between our mosque and that mosque, and like we could share funds and do common events and things like that, and dinners and all this stuff. Like that could be a way to seek out the society of one another and to kind of break down these barriers that divide society in America, for example.
Jack, you talked a little bit. You alluded to the role of Zionism, imperialism. You also devoted a few pages in the book. What can you tell us about the role of the Zionist movement or Israel or imperialist powers with concrete examples? Is it just a figment of our imagination that they try to disseminate, or are there a real effort on their part in order to stick Islam, or at least sully Islam with the problem of racism or slavery or anti-blackness?
I just want to make sure I get this guy's name right, so I don't want to say it wrong. Oh yeah, okay. So, I mean, like the I even say in the book, like, it's, I could see how somebody responds to this and be like, oh, you're like, this is some kind of protocols of elders of Zion nonsense you're talking, but it's not. I mean, the evidence is undeniable. I mean, it's even talked about by scholars who are not in this field. So, I mean, the first thing is that, I mean, the first thing to remember is that, Islamophobia industry, as Nathan Lean calls it, and I think accurately calls it, right? This is an industry that was, founded and funded by Zionism, whether it's kind of Israeli political and religious Zionism or Christian evangelical Zionism, which are also obviously pro-Israel. These groups funded from certainly the 1990s, but definitely 1980s. I mean, sorry, so maybe the 1980s, definitely 1990s, have been the main funders of the Islamophobia industry. The idea of equating Islam with terrorism, associating Muslims with being foreigners who are unassimilatable, et cetera, right? This has been well studied by people like Nathan Lean, by people like the New America Foundation with its Fear Incorporated, Wajahat Ali and people like that did this. Fear Incorporated 1, Fear Incorporated 2. You can go see this. It's also in my book. Like, it's been well established. The role of like the Jonathan Institute in Israel, founded by Benjamin Netanyahu's father, and the idea of associating Palestinian resistance with first calling it terrorism, then associating it with Soviets, then associating with Islamism, like the idea of associating Islam and terrorism, and then saying that this is a global challenge that we all face, right? Not just Israelis, has been a very clear motif and strategy in Zionist discourse or Hasbara discourse from the 1980s. So has the idea of associating Islam with slavery and associating Islam with anti-blackness. And here's a good example. Okay, so there's this guy named Charles Jacobs. He used to be a financier or like a consultant. He founded, I think in the 1990s, I can't remember exactly, but he founded I can't remember the exact name. It's like Anti-Slavery International or something. I can't remember it's an anti-slavery new abolitionist organization that focused on, like, in Sudan, freeing and redeeming South Sudanese slaves who'd been enslaved in northern Sudan, right, during the conflict in the 90s and et cetera, right? Now, this guy, Charles Jacobs, is the founder of CAMERA, Center for like Accuracy and Middle East Reporting or something. Like, this organization to this day, all it does is attack and attempt to vilify anybody in American media or academia or American society who says anything critical about Israel. That's its only focus, right? So he was also involved in funding like the major pro-Zionist documentaries. So the strand that connects everything in this guy's career is pro-Israel activism that's actually really vicious. Like, I don't mean he just goes and says, Israel's nice. Look at they have really good hummus and stuff. I mean, devoted to identifying, attacking, and trying to destroy the public reputations of anybody who criticizes Israel in the United States. That's his main career, right? Then he has this abolitionist organization. That's what he's, publicly well known for. Now, I don't doubt that he is sincere. I don't doubt that he is like sincerely trying to help people that he feels have been wronged. And by the way, those people may well have been wronged. I'm not even denying that. Right? I'm just saying, I don't doubt that. Okay. But you can go listen to this. It was from, I remember I listened to it when, from Turkey. I think it was not this summer, but last summer. I remember being in my hotel room and just like listening to it, like late at night, listening to the Facebook discussion he had, where it's incredible. I mean, he says, just to give you an idea, he says like there are, I think he says 5 countries in the world today where there's slavery. They're almost all, in every case, the slavers are Muslim and the victims are Black Africans. Like, first of all, that's just not true. Like, that just every NGO, like, Office of International Labor, it's in the UN, all these, every organization that deals with slavery, modern day slavery, none of them will say that like every place where there's modern day slavery it's being done by Muslims. That's just patently untrue, right? But that's his view. Like, if you listen to his discussions about slavery over and over again, it's the idea that Islam drives people to be slavers. Muslims have never repented for this, right? Whereas we white Western people, we've repented. Like, they've never, and everywhere where there's slavery, it's being done by Muslims. That's what he says explicitly. And I have all this in my book, like notes from his discussion. So that's like a perfect example. And you can, just look and see, like when Mark Lamont Hill, this, African-American political kind of commentator came, I think it was maybe a year or two ago, I can't remember when it happened, but he said, he sometimes says like relatively pro-Palestinian things, which in America, it doesn't really mean like that's just sort of treating Palestinians like they're human beings is controversial. You should see the attacks on him in Israeli newspapers, in Jerusalem Post and other things, and of course online, where they'll say, Mark Lamont Hill, how can you say that? You're a Black man. Arabs and Muslims are racist. Look at how Palestinians talk about Black people, et cetera, et cetera. Like the second there's any notion of solidarity between like kind of civil rights, civil liberties activism, anti-racism between Arab/Muslims and Blacks in the West, like kind of Black solidarity activism. Anytime there's any hint of solidarity, the attacks will come immediately. And they'll always originate from either Israeli think tanks or publications or from explicitly Zionist individuals or organizations to say, how can you do that? American Black people, Black Lives Matter people, how can you be allowing Muslims to stand on the same platform with you? Don't you know how they feel about, don't you know their racism? Don't you know they're racist? Don't you know they're anti-Black? So you can, like, once you know what you're looking for, the evidence is overwhelming.
Right. 2 more questions, 5 minutes each. Go ahead, Yasmin.
Okay. So just, two questions. Towards the end of your book, there was one chapter that addressed I think you used the word, the conundrum of Maliki law or something to that effect, where you cited some examples about the position of, certain examples of Maliki law and how there may have been some provision given to anti-Blackness, perhaps, or maybe that's how I understood that chapter. Where do you think that comes from? I mean, I'm not an expert on Maliki law, but it's certainly the most beknown to me after Hanafi law, and I was very interested to read about that. And then finally, I think if and maybe this could be the closing question that you can answer later, but if you wanted to have sort of a takeaway, a very important takeaway from your book that you would like, people to leave with, what would that be for you? Thank you.
Well, first of all, somebody sent me a message saying that Rubik's cubes are solved by algorithms. Yeah, thanks a lot, buddy. I know that I can't I can't use the algorithms. Okay, so that's not a helpful comment. Whoever sent this message, I know who it is. You know who you are too. It's my friend, but I just want to know that him to know that his comment is not helpful. Yeah, the Maliki. So it is really bizarre, right? Because the Maliki school of law is sort of like almost the only, except for Shafis in like West Africa or East Africa, like all Muslims like south in the Sahel and south of Sahara are Maliki, right? So that's how can the Maliki school of law be anti-Black when it's literally the school of law that is, okay, so. But, so there are a few Maliki books of law, like Al-Muqaddimah al-Waghlisiya and et cetera. There's like basically one other book that say things like, who can you look at? Like, don't look at men, don't look at strange women, like women you're not related to, except, a woman who's like old or who's Black. Because the idea being like they're not attractive. They're not. Mm-hmm. Now, or you'll see things like it's very common in historically Maliki law in, let's say, Morocco, with today historically Morocco, that you'll see something like that Blackness is an aib in zawaj, in marriage. So you can, like, mm-hmm. if you marry somebody and they turn out to be Black, like you can basically annul the marriage, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, where does this come from? So, first of all, about the first point about attractiveness, yeah, the people who wrote this stuff, like, and most of the people are essentially from what's today kind of Libya and Tunisia, and they're writing from like the 1300s to 1500s, and they're, those people are like, their society was permeated by anti-Black racism, right? Mm-hmm. So that's just a fact. That's why they wrote that, right? So there's no way to explain that other than the fact that they're literally saying a Black woman is unattractive. Now, what's interesting is the responses to that. So major scholars who are much more famous than the authors of these books come along in their commentaries and say things like, and this is like stuff written by Sheikh Ahmed Zarruq, the famous Sufi who died around 1500 of the Common Era. Like, they'll say this statement is inaccurate, like, because there are Black women who are really attractive and there are older women who are really attractive. So this is not accurate. Like, you can't make this kind of statement. It doesn't. If you want to talk about attractive women or unattractive women, that's fine. But these groups you're talking about do not equal unattractive. Mm-hmm. And some scholars will just say straight up, this is an incorrect, هذا لا ينبغي أن يقال. They'll say this should not be said. Why? Because if you live in an area where everybody is phenotypically Black, then that's like, of course, these are your peer, like this is your community. Like, these people are, these are people you're going to marry and they're attractive to you. Like, you might be attracted to other people too, but this is like, doesn't make any sense. Like, it's sort of. And one of the things that people say is, look, you have these, you write from your own perspective. Okay, listen, you're from Libya in 1500, you have this view, but don't take your view and cement it into like kind of petrify it into a fiqh book, because that's wrong, because this fiqh book that will not apply. First of all, it's incorrect. Second of all, it will be totally useless to Muslims in other areas.
This is marginal. These are marginal opinions that haven't been adopted by reading.
They're not marginal, but this is not true. They're not marginal, but these are in Maliki fiqh books that you study. If you go to Cairo, you study Maliki law, you will read these books. And it's really like, you can see the exam. You can see Muslim Black Muslims from America will talk about, you can see their testimony online. They'll talk about what it's like to be sitting and like going to Egypt to learn Maliki law. And then you come across this reading it and they're like, it's really painful. It's very hurtful.
Yeah,
So
I was shocked.
the second case about the marriage that kind of defaults in marriage, it's very interesting because in some ways it's ironic because people are always like, oh, Islamic law, it's Sharia, it's like taking these like crazy Arabian ideas from the 700s, it's like trying to impose it on America, man, like all these other people, like why can't we just change with the times? Actually, Islamic law, Sharia, is extremely deferential to custom. One of the 5 main maxims of Islamic jurisprudence and legal thought is an interpretation is al-'ada muhakkima. Custom is dispositive. Custom is definitive. So much huge swaths of the Sharia are, by the full admission of Muslim scholars, determined by custom. They say this. It's very clear, right? Now, one of the problems is that sometimes you have customs that are horrible. So imagine this, imagine you're in a society where, people think of like people who are really light skinned don't think that people who are darker skinned are suitable marriage partners for their daughters. And this one scholar is writing about this in like the 1700s in Fez. And he says, there was this chief, like he lived in the kind of today would be like the hinterland of Casablanca. Either he or his family had been slaves. We don't even know what color they were, but either he or his family had been slaves at some point. And we assume from this that it means that he was also dark-skinned. And he was very successful, very wealthy guy. And he wanted to marry this woman from a noble family. And eventually her family agreed. And her family was abused. Like they were insulted for decades. Like for years and years, they took abuse for this, that they had let their daughter marry this guy. And the jurist is saying like, it's really tough. At some point, you think to yourself, like, is it worth it? Like, if you're going to get this kind of abuse, then is it really worth pushing back against custom to make the point that, people are determined by their character and not by their skin color? So you kind of understand, like, jurists are dealing with reality. They have to deal with like American courts. Like American courts, the stuff that happens in family law courts in America, judges are constantly dealing with people who are huge jerks, like who are awful human beings, awful to their children, awful to their spouses. And it would be great if a judge would just come and be like, I'm going to change you. I'm going to change society. But like, they can't. They don't have the time. They don't have the capacity. They have to deal with reality to a certain extent. So you can see this in fatwas and in legal discussions by Muslim scholars who are writing in the Fez and its hinterlands from the 1500s to the 1900s. They're weighing this, and especially on the issue of blackness and marriage, it's really there's a lot of tension. And there's so amongst Maliki scholars, you basically see sort of 3 positions. One is, look, the Sharia tells us to defer to custom, especially in things like marriage. Like who is like, what makes a good husband in America? What makes a good husband in Turkey? Like Yasmin, your family, if you want to get married, like your family has every right to be like, let's say, a guy who has no job, no education, and spends all his day like sitting on the side of the road, playing with sticks. Okay. Like they have every right to be like, Yasmin, I don't think you should marry this person. Right. He might be a wonderful person. He might be really pious. He might be an amazing person, but this guy is not going to be provide for you. You're not going to be able to converse with him, et cetera, right? So there's, people with the best of intentions have all sorts of requirements for marriage that are socially embedded, right? Now, sometimes those things can be haram. Like if they say, I won't let you deal with this guy because, I don't know, like,
it's a different culture.
I don't know, just insert some kind of stupid idea, right? Yeah. The problem is that, so a lot of Muslim scholars, one Maliki position is like, look, we're supposed to defer to culture. If part of that custom is that blackness is seen as negative in a marriage partner, like that's just reality. We have to defer to it. The second approach is basically the opposite, which says, and this is like major scholars, like Malik himself held the second position. other huge Maliki scholars like Al-Qurtubi, Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, Qurtubi, the famous tafsir scholar, like they'll say, no, this is absolutely unacceptable because the Quran says, akramakum indallahi atqakum, the most noble in God's eyes amongst you is the most pious. And al-Muslimun tatakafa'u dama'uhum, the hadith of the Prophet, like Muslims' blood are equal. Okay, so they basically say this is racist and this is unacceptable. You cannot indulge this. The third position is interesting. It's basically kind of like the first one, but it's nuanced. So it says, look, we agree culture is dispositive, like you defer to custom, but your weird custom in Fez or wherever you are is not art. So your fatwas about this are not, this might be fine in your community, but in other communities that don't have these views, your law is irrelevant. Your fatwas are irrelevant. So this is another position you see amongst Maliki scholars.
Jack, we got only 3 minutes left. If you would like people to have a conclusion out of reading or skimming your book, what would be the main conclusions? What would be the main ideas you want to leave them with?
The main idea is don't skim the book, read the book.
Okay.
But I mean, I'd say, one that, discussions around notions of like blackness, whiteness, race, color, there's a huge diversity in human experience about these things. And you should not, especially Americans, not everybody in the world in the past or the present thinks about these things like Americans do. So don't read everything through your perspective, like be open to the other people's perspectives. The second is that the teachings of the not only the society of the Prophet, the teachings of the Prophet, the teachings of the Quran are not black. These are teachings that are against the idea of defining somebody by their appearance or by their race. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that, but there's also a tremendous heritage of anti-Black racism in Islamic tradition, and that comes from very specific region. It's there for very specific reasons. It's pervasive, and it has to be. Muslim scholars major Muslim scholars have always been fighting against this, but it's like always been an uphill battle. And it only by continuing that today will we be able to smash this idol of whiteness and smash this kind of pervasive problem of anti-Black racism in the Muslim world and in other places as well. That's what I would say. Thank
you so much, Jack, for being with us. And thank you, Yasmin, for taking part in this. This has been a fascinating and very fruitful discussion. And I hope people will have the opportunity to actually get the book and read it. It has a lot of good ideas and also thought-provoking.
Very applicable to our time. So.
Just want to remind everybody, our next book discussion will be on the 26th of this month. It will be with Dr. Munzir Qahif on his latest book on his theory of Islamic financing, which would be also a good discussion because it relates to the current economic situation. Thank you very much, and I will see you next time. Assalamu alaikum.